Good morning and welcome everyone to this webinar, introductory webinar to the TNFD. My name is Marianne. I'm the Director of Nature-related Finance at Global Canopy, and I'm also seconded into the TNFD Secretariat, where I support the task force in developing specific guidance for the agri-food sector, including the metrics. Today, we are going to focus not on the content of the framework from a theoretical or an architecture perspective. We are going to focus on practice. The reason is that on January 16th, when we announced more than 300 early adopters of the TNFD, that really signaled the change and the next step in the development from architecture and design of the 14 disclosure recommendations to stepping into having now to design market practice. And we have over the next 1.5 hours to dive in to some of the early practices of some of the leaders in the market. We both have Reckitt with us, a company that's been taking active part in the TNFD development, and also Tesco, a leader in the agri-food sector with early experience of working in the nature-related finance space. Today, over the next 1.5 hours, we are going to have a session with 2 main chapters. So first, now we're doing the welcome. Then you see the first chapter. There you see the what's listed in orange. And there we have Tesco, that we will give the floor to Tesco. First, unpacking how have Tesco managed to build the business case, because first to adopt, you need internal buy-in. Then we're going to dive into the L, the locate phase of the LEAP, which is the how-to guidance of how to implement the TNFD, which is how has Tesco really gone about in assessing its business interface with nature. Then we are going to look into the future with Tesco. What's their next steps? Then we're going to shift to the second chapter. And after the first chapter, there will be opportunities to engage. We want this to be a conversation as much as a presentation. The second chapter is what you see from 5 to 7. There we turn to Reckitt, and Reckitt will talk about how to assess and how they have designed early practices of how to assess nature-related risks, and help us also to unpack the disclosure recommendation of how do you actually engage local communities in this process, and what are some of the early learnings. Then we will also look into where you see challenges, lessons learned, and next steps as we are all designing these practices as we go. Next slide, please. And to help us, a few housekeepings. So the webinar is recorded, as you will see. We will have Q&A sessions after each of these 2 chapters, so you will have ample opportunity to engage in dialogue. If we don't get the opportunity to answer all questions, as there might be more coming in than we have time for, we will try to put these into a Q&A sheet and also get back to you. There is a very short survey at the end of the webinar, and we really sincerely hope that you will fill it out, because it will help us to learn which parts of the markets are really engaging with us on the TNFD implementation. Next slide, please. So with us today to unpack these new practices, we have a very competent and highly experienced panel. We have Thomas Hollick. He is working within sustainability at Tesco, and he's been working in that role since 2022. And there he moved into the group forest manager role early in 2023, with a role that covers 7 commodities, including soy, palm oil, and cocoa. He is focused on finding fair, equitable, and efficient solutions to tackling deforestation from within the private sector. Alongside the role at Tesco, he is also co-chairing the Soy and Landscape Working Group within the Consumer Goods Forum, Forest Positive Coalition. Then we have from Reckitt, Dr. Tom Blenkinsopp. Tom joined Reckitt in 2021, and he's responsible for identifying and managing emerging concerns and risks with regard to the sustainability of ingredients and materials used in the Reckitt products. He leads on the nature and biodiversity work with NBI, assessing Reckitt's ecosystem impacts across their nature-related raw material supply chains, but has over decades of work experience in sustainability, including real-time tracking, as well as product and organizational environmental footprinting. Last but not least, we have Dr. Gus Fordyce. He's trained and worked as a marine ecosystem scientist before joining NBI, where he now works as a lead scientist. He combines international experience in field ecology, experimental science, and spatial data analysis from working within academic and non-governmental organizations. He is keen to help the private sector find ambitious but workable and practical solutions for effectively contributing to the conservation of biodiversity. So welcome to the panelists. We're looking very much forward to hearing from your experience and expertise. Next slide. So just to frame this discussion, as we also said in the outset, we now have this pyramid or this stack of architecture that constitutes the TNFD framework. On the top, you see the 14 disclosure recommendations. And then if you move to the third place to the top, you have the LEAP approach, which is the how-to guidance of the TNFD. This is not mandatory, but it is a four-phase approach that enables a company or an FI to gather the information you need to be able to disclose on the 14 disclosure recommendations. And during the process of designing the TNFD, because we are science-based as a framework, but we are also practical. So it was designed as an open innovation process, and therefore we had a whole cohort of companies that stepped forward and said, we are going to pilot test the TNFD framework and give you feedback on what's practical, what's not practical, and where can we feed in lessons learned. And Tesco and Reckitt were two of those companies that stepped forward. So what you will hear today are the fruits and the lesson learned and insights from these piloting approaches. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. And then from my side, then we will hand it over to the meat of the webinar. So just to put it into the context also of Global Canopy. So we were one of the founding partners of the TNFD and also one of 4 piloting partners. And therefore we help enable organizations to better understand their nature-related impacts and dependencies by addressing data challenges and also by capacity building. And for this webinar, this is the fruit, the content of it, of a collaborative partnership between Nature-based Insights that worked with Tesco to pilot the TNFD LEAP approach as part of Global Canopy's program, piloting program, and also NBI that worked with Reckitt on a separate pilot. So now I have the pleasure to hand the floor over to Thomas from Tesco, who will start to unpack for us how he managed to build the business case together with colleagues in Tesco for venturing into nature-based analytics. Over to you, Thomas.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for having me on. If you would go to the next slide, if that would be okay, please. Fantastic. So yeah, I'm really pleased to come along and talk about this today. So for TNFD for Tesco, you know, what does that really mean? I'm not going to just talk at the slides. I want to dive into a bit of the story that underpins, you know, why we participated in the pilot and why we'll be working with TNFD going forward. So I think the first thing is to say, and obviously everyone is aware of this, but nature, you know, nature and your impacts on nature are incredibly hard to measure. And the reality is from a Tesco perspective, we are directly or indirectly sourcing from nearly every country in the world with various products. So to be able to start to assess what those impacts are and what our true dependency on nature really is in a consistent way is going to be critical to assuring that we are then taking the right action rather than fumbling around in the dark. We undertook this pilot for palm oil because it helps us to understand how the LEAP process will support our future disclosure with the TNFD, but also to understand our own internal wider sourcing policies around deforestation and palm oil. As we go through the LEAP process for other products, some of which were mentioned at the start during my introduction, we'll be able to continue to develop that evidence base, and that's what we're looking for, and then use that to work on how we can manage our supply chains with our suppliers. The next kind of important part is the fact that investors and customers are obviously incredibly important to Tesco. We are seeing a much greater interest than we have previously from both investors and from customers on how we are managing our supply base and what our sourcing policies are. We obviously then need to take into account that this isn't just a case of, are you sourcing a commodity in the right way from the right country, but what is that impact of that commodity on nature in that area, and are we taking the right steps to doing that? So again, you can see that there's kind of that external pressure to be taking this seriously and to be working on it in a constructive manner. We're already reporting under the Taskforce on climate-related disclosures, and obviously with TNFD aligning really well to that, that helps us, and I'm sure many other corporates, in combining that information and working on it collectively. And then the last and just as important point is that this is about business resilience. The reality is that our ecosystems are truly important to the products that we provide to customers that they love. And without taking this seriously and building a plan that takes nature into account, we wouldn't be doing our customers, our investors, or our colleagues the right service if we weren't to be taking that seriously. We recognize that whilst much more work needs to be done for ourselves, by us working with TNFD, that can really prove to be a catalyst to improve the way that we source and to start to make the kind of positive change that we need to see in the biomes and regions that we're sourcing from in order to continue that production for many, many years to come.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you for building the case and also highlighting that it's about business resilience. So it's not only nice to have, it's neat to have to understand that interface with nature and also the real risks associated with it. Now I have the pleasure, before we go into questions, to hand it over to you, Gus, who you've been working with Thomas and his team to navigate the complex supply chain to locate your interface with nature, which we know is challenging in this sector. So over to you, Gus.
Thanks a lot, Marianne, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So I'll just sort of briefly give an overview of the technical approach that we took towards, if you like, that first stage in the LEAP approach, which is locating your interface with nature, which, depending on where you are in the sector, which company you kind of work for, this might be an incredibly simple task, but with certain supply chains like palm oil, it can actually be a very complicated question to ask. And when you think about integrating, let's say, nature-based solutions into your supply chain, we'll really try to get an understanding of your impact upon nature. So next slide, please. So Indonesia is the world's largest producer of palm oil, all right? Palm oil constitutes 5% of its total GDP from exports. It's the world's most consumed vegetable oil, so why we might not consume it a lot in Europe, in places like India and China, it's consumed all over the place and in all products. And it's the highest yielding vegetable oil crop in the world. So when you take just that into account, there's a lot of economic potential around palm oil, which is part of the reason why the Indonesian government's so interested in it. And in terms of number of people, most palm oil producers are rural smallholders. So there's a big opportunity there for palm oil to contribute towards growth in rural economies. But obviously we know, well, maybe not obviously to everyone, but we know that it's been associated with human rights violations, deforestation, massive carbon emissions, and that deforestation is on peatlands. So there's a real imperative at the moment to balance economic potential with environmental preservation. This is all the more evident when we see the fact that stuff like the Russia-Ukraine war has caused a drop or a spike in the prices of sunflower oil. People come to depend upon palm oil once again. So exclusion is not necessarily the solution, but a lot of companies will say that I buy palm oil from Indonesia, but not all of Indonesia is equal. So the distribution of species, as you can see on the two figures on the right here, is heterogeneous across the country. The distribution of threats to biodiversity is heterogeneous, and production patterns are also different in different islands within Indonesia. So if you want to ask the question, where do I invest in collective action, you probably need to know where within this vast country do I actually buy from. Next slide, please. Now, most companies operating within the EU anyway, will have palm oil mill lists as part of their traceability efforts within their palm oil supply chains. Now, coming to the point where we have a universal mill list put together by Global Forest Watch and the World Resources Institute is undoubtedly extremely valuable. But where your mills are doesn't always necessarily reflect where the most volume is coming from. So what we're trying to get to here is a sort of volumetric breakdown of the palm oil supply chain. So take these two maps. On the top right, you can see the distribution of palm oil mills throughout Indonesia. On the bottom right, you can see the distribution of planted areas and production volumes from the Indonesian Ministry of Agriculture. And what we can see in some areas like northern and central Sumatra, it really does match up. The more mills there are, the more production there is. But there are other areas, particularly Indonesian Borneo, so Western and Southern Kalimantan, Western and Central Kalimantan, where there's a huge planted area, it's huge production volumes, but a comparatively small number of mills. So these are the kind of areas where your traditional traceability information that companies currently have might not be actually reflecting the true location of your impact. So once you start moving towards this idea of a volumetric breakdown, you can ask questions like, am I buying large volumes from a small number of mills, which might make it more tractable to engage those mills directly? Where is my core supply shed? So where do I invest most of my efforts? Which areas are most important, or conversely, a sort of peripheral within your palm oil supply chain? And then just going through that process allows you to find out where are the gaps in the information I need in order to make an informed decision here. So that was something we figured out just by having those early conversations, is the more questions you ask, the more you realize what kind of data you need to start asking for from suppliers. So next slide, please. So companies will commonly have, I buy X amount of palm oil from, let's say, tier 1 suppliers, and here is my associated mill list. What we actually have to do is start to break down that total volume that comes from those tier 1 suppliers through all the different tiers of the palm oil supply chain. So this is a very simplified diagram of the process that we took. And one thing you realize that I want to emphasize with this particular slide is that you need to actually map out trade routes that are occurring within the palm oil supply chain. So in one instance here, we had one supplier to Tesco's that sold them X tonnage of palm oil, and that supplier was sourcing it from 5 different tier 2 refineries. Now, when you look at those refineries online, you'll see that they declare the percentage of their sourcing that comes from Indonesia or Malaysia, and they'll declare the mills that are associated with their supplies. But what they'll have is they'll have a category called local sourcing, which actually means they're buying from other refineries within Europe. So there are these trade routes going in all directions between these different refineries. But what it means is that if refinery A says, I get 10% from Indonesia and half of it comes from local sourcing, then actually what those other refineries are sourcing from Indonesia is where you need to reallocate that volume to. So to really start to break down this supply chain, pull apart the strands of spaghetti and trace volumes down to individual mills or areas, you really need to take account of these trade routes. Next slide, please. Now, once you've done this, you'll eventually get to a point where you're like, okay, I have a whole series of refineries and a whole series of mills and a set volume that are broken down and traced along the different trade routes, right? So you've got volumes and mills, but not really how much volume is coming from each mill. So we use trade supply chains here and looked at production patterns across Indonesia. So we identified all the districts that were associated with Tesco's suppliers' supply chains. We then took those districts and using trays, we actually looked at relative production volumes by comparing all those different districts across a number of years. And then we used that to make an informed estimate of, from refinery A buys from these 10 districts, based on their recent production volumes, we're going to estimate that this 100 tons that we know comes from Indonesia refinery A, that 80 tons comes from district 1, 2 tons comes from district 2, etc., etc. So you end up doing this for all the suppliers, and then you end up getting a whole series of loads of different mill lists that you then need to merge and deduplicate, which can be facilitated using the universal mill list. So you get what is obviously an intimidating figure. Oh, I've got 3,500 mills in my supply chain. Well, no, you actually have 1,000 mills in your supply chain. They're just repeated multiple times, and you're buying from them multiple times through multiple people. So it's important you do this in order to make this a sort of digestible task. And one thing I want to emphasize is what we set out to do at the beginning of this is basically do it with minimal amounts of technical expertise. So not using coding or minimal amounts of geospatial analysis, just trying to do this with publicly available company data and Microsoft Excel, just to sort of prove that it could be done. Once we did this for all the suppliers, we then came to this point where we're like, right, we have now a district and a volume linked to Tesco. Next slide, please. We then wanted to do a prioritization process. So we use the biodiversity impact metric, which looks at land area. So you take those sourcing volumes and you divide it by yield, and you get an estimated land area that is required to supply Tesco's within that district. Proportion of biodiversity lost on the assumption of its very intensive plantation system, and biodiversity importance. So already when you look at that footprint, you're looking at variation within distribution of biodiversity and within your supply chain. So it's no longer just Indonesia in general, it's where in Indonesia. We then, for dependency analyses, we looked at the extent of critical natural assets in each district. So this is a sort of proxy for how much people in that area are depending upon nature through the delivery of ecosystem services. We used the TRACE tool to look at deforestation exposure in each of these districts. And then importantly, we also used a sort of separate data set to these more common tools to look at how much palm oil was produced by smallholders and what percentage of mills in the associated area are uncertified. Now, we took this approach because of EUDR, basically. The highest risk of EUDR is that smallholders get excluded from the global palm oil supply chain, and that exclusion is probably going to be on the basis of certification. So if you can find areas where there are loads of smallholders and no certified mills, that actually has the highest social risk of being excluded from the developmental gains that can be achieved through the palm oil economy. So we're starting to get a bit of a social element in here. And then we use the STAR metric to look at opportunities to minimize threats to species and restore habitats to help endangered species. And then once we took all these data layers together, we then gave each district a score and got to this point where we said, right, based on this process, which this process is likely going to be different for different people, depending on the context, your interests around biodiversity, the structure of your supply chain. After getting to this process, we went from, okay, we've located my interface of nature across this whole country. Now, if I prioritize this one landscape that I really want to focus on for investing in collective action based on these criteria. And I'll pick that up within the Reckitt case study afterwards. So for now, I'll hand back to Tom Hollick. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Gus. And as everyone can see, it is a really thorough exercise, and it's only made possible by the LEAP approach and the tools and the framework that TNFD provides. What I'm going to home in on a bit more here is the kind of reality that Tesco faces across its whole palm supply chain. So these are unlikely to be surprises to many of you, but the reality is that the challenge of the palm oil supply chain is that it is incredibly opaque. It's vast and from thousands upon thousands of farms and mills and suppliers, and that it is thousands of miles away. Tesco, being a retailer, sits at the very end of this supply chain and is often the most we can do is using our influence and our convening power to work with not only our supply chain and their suppliers, but also our competitors and others around industry to build an approach that works for everyone. The reality is that Tesco in and of itself is unable to change the challenges that this supply chain throws up, but is obviously more than willing to attempt to work with others to deliver on that. One of the most important parts as well for Tesco is that over the last couple of years, planet has become kind of the third integral pillar of Tesco alongside customers and communities. So we are ensuring that as we build our business over the next few years, we're putting sustainability and challenges such as this at the heart of what we do and the way that we buy products and the way that our customers then receive them. And it's also clear that not only do we need to be able to put out that message that we are incredibly committed to tackling the challenges that are posed by sourcing these commodities, but we need to be able to work with our supply chain in order to even get this off the ground. So we make sure that we're in regular dialogue, that we sit with our suppliers, that we talk to them, and that we understand what their challenges are, and that we build policies and processes that work for both of us, whilst also delivering on this really key challenge. Now, in terms of where Tesco has been for the last few years, since 2020, roughly 2020, we've been committed to sourcing 100% RSPO segregated material, essentially DCF, and been using that as the real marker of, where we are we tackling deforestation? But the reality is, we're working through TNFD, but also the challenges that are being posed to us by our customers and our investors, as I said before, whilst, and I cannot emphasize this enough, whilst RSPO is a very, very good tool The unfortunate nature of certification, the reality of certification is that there are limits to it. And the limits are likely that of what it covers, of how far it can reach, and what kind of change it can deliver. Only by continuing to maintain that target, and again, RSPO segregated is for us the high bar. We need to be able to combine that with other approaches. And that's why one of the many reasons why TNFD is really important to us, because you have to look beyond that relatively narrow view of, is certification the answer? It is, but it has to be combined with other tools as well. And then most importantly, Gus has mentioned it, and I can see on many of the questions, there's a theme about EUDR. EUDR has, to a certain extent, changed the game. You know, we've been operating in a world where voluntary commitments have been the kind of standard for where a company is and where it aims to get to. Now, whilst I strongly applaud the European Union for its piece of legislation and for finally putting deforestation of any type, you know, on the map to be eliminated through a legislative tool, it doesn't go far enough, and it doesn't cover all of the aspects that we would want it to. And again, nature is kind of one of those glaring omissions that whilst you can tackle deforestation, the reality is that is not the solution to the entire problem. You have to tackle nature, you have to tackle deforestation, and you have to tackle social concerns as well. As Gus mentioned, smallholders being likely omitted from essentially certified or verified supply chains in order to comply with this legislation is a short-term view on what is a long-term problem, and we need to work collectively with our supply chain and with the big actors in that supply chain to ensure that they are included and that we are providing a holistic solution to this challenge. It's not going to happen overnight, but by us undertaking the LEAP process, I think that helps set us on the right path to getting that done. Next slide, please. Fantastic. And then what I wanted to talk about is, now that we've kind of on the same page when it comes to the reality of the challenge that faces Tesco and our competitors as well and others, I wanted to talk about specifically what going through the LEAP process and working with TNFD has done specifically for our palm oil strategy. So again, as I said, we traditionally have focused on certification. And now that we've got the EUDR coming in, we realize and recognize that you have to go beyond certification because it's now a legal requirement, but also we need to be able to take this more holistic view. So the first thing is help us to understand is, you know, where is our supply chain specifically in Indonesia, and what is the impact that it's potentially having on nature? We've not been able to do this in the past, and you're obviously expecting me to keep singing TNFD's praises, but it has been such an eye-opening experience to have this information relayed back to us and to be able to work with the team, especially Gus, on how this impact is being felt. So what that's then led us to is into a number of actions that we're going to be taking over the next year and years to come, which is about making sure we are working incredibly close with our supply chain to understand these better. So we need to be building evidence from our supply chains, from their supply chains, to understand exactly where our palm is coming from, and then to put it through this process to understand what impact that palm is having. It shows that we need to start investing, not just in and of ourselves, again, working collaboratively with all sorts of actors to build those supply chain mapping and traceability systems that ultimately must underpin this work. Because if you don't know where it's coming from, you cannot hope to quantify what the impact is and then thus take action in order to rectify that. We will be looking at where we can prioritize investment into on-the-ground products in the palm oil landscape. Again, this isn't just from TNFD, this is also for EUDR and their own personal commitments. But how can we reach down into the supply chain and put money where it will help the best in order to support, for example, smallholders in production countries to either become certified or to build their own sustainable practices that allow them to access us and the European market. We need to be able to also use, having gone through this process, we need to be able to use our own size, collaboration and convening power to bring together various actors to galvanize that investment and to tackle this on a sector level. And that's one of the things I'm really proud to do as part of the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition and the work that we do within that group. This process as well helps us to support research and innovation in alternative production systems beyond what is already currently out there. This will be a slow, potentially generational issue that we'll be tackling, but we need to get started now. And by showing the impact that can be had on making relatively small changes within those production landscapes and working with those communities, which is quite possibly the most important part, because unless you don't have buy-in on the ground, you're not going to have buy-in up the supply chain. So we need to be able to show and demonstrate and support those as we move through those actions. We do at all possible points align with kind of best practices. So not only the tools and the framework that the TNFD provides, but also the accountability framework to the principles of the RSPO certification that we'll be looking to source, and working with other actors and organizations to ensure that we're always taking the strongest possible approach towards our palm oil sourcing. Now, I left this one in here because I think it shows an ambition, not a stated target of Tesco at the moment, but an ambition that over time, I'm sure that there will come a stage with, thanks to the EUDR and others and the UK legislation, where we'll need to start having conversations with brands. Currently at Tesco, our work is focused on own brand, and whilst that's a sizable volume, we need to start building that relationships and those conversations with key brands around the world in order to align our processes. And the reality is many of the processes are aligned, but you need to start having those kind of joined up conversations in an honest and transparent manner. And then possibly for my proudest part of this entire process is, we've started with palm oil, and there are other commodities that I have responsibility for that are forming the products that Tesco sells and that our customers love. That over time, if we can demonstrate it works for palm oil, one of the most difficult commodities to be able to move in this direction, then we can start looking at others, and we can start looking at palm, at coffee, at cocoa, timber, and so forth, and start to bring that within the LEAP process and the TNFD framework for Tesco. And again, that's not going to happen overnight. I know it must sound disappointing that we're not saying this is happening today or tomorrow, but it is coming, and it's building. And being able to be a part of this process has given us that opportunity to really build a really strong case for taking this in a new direction. So it's exciting, it's fun, it's obviously daunting, but it's been fantastic to work with Gus and the team, and to work within the TNFD framework. And I'm looking forward to that continuing, and us building a stronger and stronger case as we go down over the years. So thank you again, and I look forward to any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Gus, for this highly relevant intervention. And you can see the relevance of it from all the questions flowing in. And there's definitely a theme around how does this work you've done in the piloting, but also going forward with implementation of the TNFD help you, or how are you going to work alongside the EUDR and the TNFD? I think you've unpacked that quite a lot for us, Thomas. That's been super helpful. But there is also a question around the CSRD. I don't know if you want to share a few reflections, maybe they're more early days, but in terms of how do you envision, this is a question from Bernard Wright. How does Tesco envision TNFD will work alongside EUDR and the CSRD? If you could say a few words about the CSRD.
Yeah, unfortunately, CSRD isn't one of my strong points. It's more EUDR, but obviously we're looking at the CSRD, we're looking at the EUDR and TNFD and others, and thinking about how it can be brought together essentially as a package. I do see them as very, very complementary, but I unfortunately at this point wouldn't be able to talk about in detail about how specific aspects of the framework will help us with CSRD. But ultimately, as I said, the idea is to start bringing more commodities through the TNFD framework. That will help us, I'm sure, with our submissions to CSRD as that comes about.
Yeah.
So sorry, I couldn't give a bit more on that.
No problem. I can just say from the TNFD Secretariat side that we are releasing this month this crosswalk table between the CSRD and the TNFD, because that is a recurrent question, of course. If I'm implementing the ESRS and TNFD, how much can I do just one of them, and then I can tick all the boxes. So we will come back to you with more on that. Then there is one question from Dr. Flavia de Sousa Mendes, and I think that's both for you, Gus and Thomas, and that's more on the data side. So it says, do you use satellite images or products from satellite images to support TNFD recommendations? If yes, which are the biggest challenges around this? Should we start with you, Gus, on satellite images?
Yeah, we did. When it came to prioritizing the landscape, so if you like, the sort of final bit of the process, we did use satellite imagery, specifically that high resolution map of smallholder palm oil plantations produced by Adria Descal. You know, I think the biggest challenge with the data stuff is, well, there are probably two of them. One is that there is a lot of, I don't want to call it repetition, but borderline repetition and tweaking of existing data sets and tools to the point where, unless you have a very technical background, is positively overwhelming. You see the number of different tools and data sets and this, and it can do that. And you're sitting there faced with thousands and thousands of options, all of which are fundamentally slightly different variations on each other. But unless you have a very technical background and the time to look into them, it's completely overwhelming. And the other one is that a lot of these data sets might be produced as a one-off. So it might help you generate a baseline or a sort of understanding as of 2021. But unless they're repeatedly produced on like an annual basis, then they're actually not very suitable for something like monitoring. So I think that when it comes to data stuff, the biggest thing to help ground you is that the data is a tool. It's not the end point. Is not choosing a data set. Is not choosing, you know, like the disclosure is not the end point of the whole process. It is something to help guide the process, to tell you like, oh, this is what you need to know. But the process is going to be, okay, I can't do offsetting for biodiversity because it's so place-based. So where am I buying from? What are the issues? Okay, I want to help do something about that, and I want to help the community lead that process of doing something about it. If the disclosure becomes the endpoint, then the data stuff becomes almost overinflated in its importance. In reality, data is a tool to get us where we need to go. But yeah, those are the two big challenges: is how often they're updated, and the fact there's too much of it.
Thank you so much, Gus. And we have I'll just jump onto another question for you, Thomas, because we have such a long list and I want to pay attention to as most of them as we can. So we have one from Genevieve Redgraves. She mentions that investors are asking, or you mentioned that investors are asking more questions about sourcing policies. Are there any certain products other than palm oil that they are engaging with you on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Mainly, I would say it's things like soy. Soy is probably the one I'm asked the most questions on, and then it's palm oil. It's not limited. There are many different questions that come through from investors, and obviously we're more than happy to engage with them and discuss. But I would say soy is probably the next most asked commodity that they ask questions for, and obviously we haven't gone through the LEAP process for soy yet, but I expect that we'll be able to start doing that as we learn more and progress.
And then there's a follow-up question, which is around which other supply chains are you prioritizing to map out next to palm oil?
That's a good point. I don't want to jump the gun, but essentially, instead of giving a specific, and I apologize for the politician's answer, I think the best way of answering it is that there are 7 kind of specific commodities that we look at this particular point, mainly guided by the EUDR, but also covered by the fact that there are significant volumes of them in Tesco. We will consider from that kind of stable of those which ones to go through next. But you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something like palm, or it was something, if it was something like soy, if it was something like cocoa. But we don't yet have kind of a definitive answer on that. But I would expect that another will follow relatively shortly.
Thank you so much. And then over to you, Gus, with a question on, and I think Cecile, she's already engaged with it a bit in the chat, but how long did it take to make this traceability exercise, in terms of, you already highlighted that you used only publicly available data, so you made the barrier of entry sort of lower. But I think one is, how long did it take you? And then also, how many resources did it require?
A laptop and Microsoft Excel, loads of PDFs and PDF readers, but you can get online PDF converters nowadays. So in terms of like technical resources and software, it really wasn't that much. I think that, I mean, I just want to sort of compliment what Tom was saying about the importance of investing in traceability. My experience so far is that when people talk about nature, loads of the tools are built around, you know, estimating company footprints. Traceability is the massive elephant in the room that that does not seem to get enough attention in the conversation, because locating your interface of nature is so difficult in some of these supply chains, especially if you're buying it through something like commodity brokers. So that is super important. For us, we had to find all the data. I had to trace all the different trade routes. I mean, I think that if you had someone extremely dedicated just doing that, you could probably do it within about 10 weeks, depending on how much data you have. But once you have the systems in place, as long as you've invested in, let's say, training for an individual to take the lead on that particular process on an annual basis, or every 2 years, then it shouldn't take more than 1/4 of the year to go from, okay, here's all the sourcing data, and here are the districts I think I invest in. I mean, bearing in mind that in stuff like investments in landscape programs that you would really look to guide using this kind of analysis, they're not sort of 1-year investments and next year you just invest somewhere else. It's all very sort of long term. So the efficiency of it taking 2 or 3 months depends on how often you want to do it.
Yeah, and just if I may just add something to that, when Gus's response to his previous question about data shouldn't be the goal. We want more data in order to have an accurate understanding of what's going on, but data can never become the goal. Traceability for its own sake is not the useful tool. We need that data to then impact on the ground and that to become the long-term goal. This problem will never, ever go away. We need to have the right systems in place to monitor it and to tackle it and to ultimately root it out. But just data for its own sake will not get you anywhere. You need to be able to use it and keep using it.
Yeah, and it's just the voluntary frameworks, the legislation and stuff. These are all goalposts, but they're sort of interim goalposts. Keep in mind on the ultimate goal here, which is to kind of preserve nature for the foreseeable future.
Definitely. Yeah. So we just have time for one more question, which is sort of one question with 3 folded into it. So I'll hand it over to you, Thomas, and you can pick which one you think you want to answer first. Is the issue you referred to with the RSPO certification is that it doesn't give you traceability to the plantation? Is that the issue? Is your understanding of EUDR that you will need to be able to provide this information separately? Third question, for food retailers, would the focus just be for own brands for EUDR? Take your pick.
Interesting. Every time I go on to a call, it ends up talking about EUDR, no matter where we start. So I would say, look, there's no issue with RSPO. RSPO does the job that it's set out to do well. It can always get better, and it's constantly under review, and that's one of the reasons why RSPO is so strong. The reality is, though, that RSPO doesn't look at nature. So if we were to just use RSPO as the marker for everything, we'd be doing ourselves and our colleagues and our investors and customers a disservice. So that's why we use it as a one of multiple tools in order to look at this problem accurately and then build those long-term solutions. We're not there yet, but being on this process helps us move that through. So again, just to emphasize, RSPO does the job it's meant to do well. Obviously, strengthening can happen all the time, and that's great, but it's not the be-all and end-all, and it won't ever be the be-all and end-all for us. I'll jump to the third question because I think I've slightly forgotten the second, but the third one on EUDR, the EUDR's coverage is for brand and own brand. In terms of our specific approach to the EUDR, that's not something I'm going to dig into here, but I would say that it takes into account the fact that the EUDR makes no difference essentially between a brand and an own brand product. The goal is compliance, and that's what the role is. And sorry, Marianne, what was the second question?
Is your understanding of EUDR that you will need to be able to provide this information separately, which is traceability to the plantation?
So I don't want to speak as a retailer. Let's talk about it as if in general, the spirit of the legislation, as I understand it, the spirit of the legislation is that you would need to be able to trace down to plantation for the entirety of the supply. Now, the way that legislation is written, does that mean that each individual actor will need to do that? That is unlikely, but there are definitely key actors within the supply chain that will. And so we look forward to that information being made available in a way that is accessible and affordable as well.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Gus, for engaging with, and thank you so much for all these questions. So this signals the end of the first chapter and the focus on Tesco, and we now turn to Reckitt. Just to let you know, we are recording the webinar, and we're also going to share the slides afterwards. There was a question around that. So now I have the pleasure to hand over to Dr. Tom Blenkinsopp, who's going to take us and unpack again, how did he manage, together with colleagues, to build the business case for nature and to venture into this work at the level of Reckitt? Over to you, Dr. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. Thank you very much for the introduction. And for those of you who may have joined the call a little bit later, my background, I'm the Product Sustainability and Stewardship Lead here at Reckitt. And for those of you who are not familiar with Reckitt, we're a consumer goods company that's headquartered here in the UK, but we have global brands in health, hygiene, and nutrition. As an organisation, part of what we see as our purpose, as our kind of drive, is that we strive to be a regenerative business that adds value to society and the environment. And like many on the call, I'm sure we have a wide range of complex natural raw material supply chains. We rely on healthy ecosystems in particular to produce the sustainable rubber, the latex that we use in one of our, it's our key material in our Durex brand to make our condoms. That's why we partnered with Gus and the team from NBI, from Nature-based Insights, to develop this analytical framework that assesses our impacts, risks, and dependencies, and then also helps us identify where the opportunities are to protect and restore nature and biodiversity at the local level. And that's a particularly key part of that this has to be done locally. I'd also like to say that partnership with NBI is critical, as it ensures that the approach we're taking is science-based and it's evidence-based. So ultimately, not only do we end up protecting ecosystems, we want to strengthen them through the appropriate interventions, nature-based solutions that we will put in place as part of the work we're doing. So if I could just ask, we could answer the next slide. Oh, next one again. Sorry, I forgot we had that title slide in there. So just going to talk a bit about our dependency on nature. And like all organisations, we are dependent on nature and rely on healthy ecosystems and the many benefits they provide. So water, temperature regulation, as well as the natural materials that go into our products. And these natural materials are often the primary resource for several of our products here at Reckitt. So I obviously already mentioned about latex that we use in our Durex condoms, but we also use a wide range of fragrances that go into our perfumes as part of our Airwick brand as well. And as an organisation, we are increasingly aware of the challenges faced in our supply chains that are arising from increasing threats to nature, essentially. It's not just us, however, that the business world is waking up to the fact that we are utterly dependent on nature and its resources. We all need to consider our use and reliance on nature and its natural assets and build them into our core part of our business and take them into consideration. We need to start protecting and enabling nature and natural resources for the future and for the long term. Something Gus mentioned a few moments ago is that the work that we're doing is not just something we can just do 1 year. It has to be a year-on-year continuous process that we focus on the investments and the kind of how we restore nature and protect it. At Reckitt, we've already been working for a long time on protecting ecosystems, but now we need to look at how do we do this better and also strengthen and enhance those ecosystems we rely on to make them more resilient. Especially in the long term, and considering how do we manage the risk and turn that into an opportunity for us as a business and for the local communities in the areas we source from. To do this, though, we need to better understand these ecosystems, and to do that, we need better data. And again, I'm not going to rehash some of the points that Gus just made during the Tesco's presentation on some of the challenges there, but basically, because of nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services and how complicated they are, this has to be done on a landscape by landscape basis. And that's the approach we've been taking here at Reckitt and with NBI. Ultimately, there are no healthy people or healthy organisations without a healthy planet. So there's a shared common interest along the value chain in tackling these issues. And as you just heard from Thomas from Tesco's, who's actually we supply, they're one of our customers, there is this opportunity for a joined up approach along the supply chain. And I think that's really where we need to get to in order to be successful. And it's that concept, that understanding that is now part of our core sustainability conversation and a core part of our business. As our products, we say, are there to support people's health, hygiene, and nutrition, which are in turn are therefore reliant on natural resources from all around the world. It's because of this understanding that we've aligned with the TNFD principles and have been involved in the LEAP process and piloting that framework. We understand, as I'm sure all the members of the TNFD and probably many of you on the call, that the climate and nature crisis isn't just an environmental issue, it's a social issue, it's an economic issue, and it's also a security issue. And it's this understanding that has helped underpin and help build the business case for assessing our nature-related risks. Our stakeholders, from investors to governments, our customers, the local communities and partners that we work with on the ground, are increasingly recognising the importance of protecting our natural ecosystems and looking at how we prioritise ways to protect them and the people who rely on them as well. It's not just about the resources we get from those environments, it's the people that live in those areas as well. So we really do see the TNFD as providing that robust methodology that brings alignment to a centralised standard and subsequently complementary activity across the business world. And as I mentioned a moment ago, no healthy people, no healthy organisations without a healthy planet. And that's a mantra that we're very much following here at Reckitt, and the TNFD framework provides that platform for better alignment and collaboration, ultimately resulting in a better understanding of how we tackle the issues that we're all facing. Because our impact, the work that we're doing here at Reckitt, will only count if we're all working towards a shared goal, and we can only move faster working together. Ultimately, getting this right matters for everybody involved. So it's not just us looking from a Reckitt perspective, it's that consideration of other organisations and other people that we interact with as well. So if we could drop down onto the next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we went about assessing our nature-related risks and dependencies and the work that we've been doing before I'll hand over to Gus, who's going to talk you through some of the aspects of the work in a bit more detail. So when we started out on this journey, the first step was really to identify and prioritise the many natural raw materials we use and which ones we wanted to focus on. So we started off by first focusing on those that could be associated with high impacts, and then those that are most important to our business. Through that process, that's how we decided to start with latex, which for us is farmed in southern Thailand, and it's where we started testing the approach that we've developed with MBI. And the first step in this was to locate and define the boundaries of our footprint. And working with MBI, we've developed a robust approach by which we can delineate a landscape to achieve this. We wanted to avoid drawing, say, arbitrary boundaries, as an interface with nature isn't arbitrary. We didn't just want to draw a box or a circle around our sites, our farming locations, because that's not how this all works, and that's not how nature interacts or how we interact with nature. So this process then in turn enables us to ensure that we are correctly considering all the areas of our business and the farms, the plantations that we source from, and where they actually interface with nature. So where we can actually identify where our dependencies could be and where local biodiversity nature could be being impacted as well. From there, we then have been able to evaluate the impact of our latex plantations, including any forest areas or species that are impacted. And we've been able to give each area a score, and we've used the biodiversity impact metric to do this, the BIM score. And this has allowed us to model the ability of different interventions as well, or other nature-based solutions that we could introduce into the landscape to reduce our impacts on biodiversity and on nature. So we're currently using this information to build a baseline for our impact on biodiversity in the sourcing area within Thailand. But one of the big pieces of work that we really have spent a lot of time on as well is our engagement with local stakeholders. And this is absolutely critical, not only when it comes to gathering information, but also to ensure the viability of any interventions that we want to put in place, or any roadmaps that we want to develop for nature recovery. It's often the case that our suppliers and our farmers are the most critical, the most key stakeholders when it comes to protecting these ecosystems. So engaging with those local stakeholders also provides us with a better understanding of what's actually happening on the ground, and helps us identify, well, where should we be prioritising our activities within the landscape, but also ensuring that we're identifying all of the dependencies and all of the impacts that our operations could be having in that sourcing region. So I'll pause there, and I'll pass over to Gus, as said, now he's going to talk a bit about analysing the landscape in more detail. And I'll have a look at some of the questions that are coming in the chat and see if I can address some of them, but I'll pick up as well at the end, as Thomas did.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Tom. It's great to hear about, as always, about Reckitt's ambitions in the nature space. Obviously, we've been working together for a few years now, so I'm more than familiar with it. So just picking up about where I left off with the Tesco stuff. So let's just say, you go through the process of teasing apart the supply chain, and through this, all these different dimensions of biodiversity and risk, you find a priority landscape. The landscape's still quite a big area, right? And so you're like, okay, well, within this landscape, what's my footprint within it? And where do I implement what I've called nature-based solutions here? But, where do I implement mitigation actions, if you like, whether it's investing in helping people attain certification or investing in precision agriculture, for example. Next slide, please. So as Tom mentioned, this is a very brief overview of the years of work we've put in so far into the latex case study, which is based in Surat Thani province of southern Thailand. Now, Thailand is the world's largest exporter of natural rubber, and Surat Thani province is the most productive subnational region. It's also where production has been happening for the longest. So it's a very historical and culturally important region for rubber production within Thailand. Now, recently, in the last 8 years or so, there's been evidence of rubber production spreading into the northern, more montane regions of Thailand, and spreading at a rate which we saw in southern Thailand, but further back in the past. So there's sort of opportunity here to demonstrate that if you can demonstrate successful mass production of latex through agroforestry in southern Thailand, where it's culturally very important, it's been established for a very long time, can you then take these learnings and bring them and spread them throughout the country, including in areas in the north where deforestation is high at the moment? So yeah, rubber production, extremely important product, but it's associated with deforestation and the pollution of aquatic ecosystems. Smallholder producers, which pretty much make up the entire latex supply chain, are exposed to fluctuating prices. So in price dips, they actually struggle to make a living off of rubber, and that, combined with other market dynamics, mean that they might switch to palm oil or durian to help boost their income. Now, durian and palm oil are both more intensive plantation systems, so you really want to be able to figure out a way to help reduce their exposure to fluctuating prices so they don't switch to more intensive agricultural systems. And this is reflected in the fact that only recently the Rubber Authority in Thailand has expanded their subsidies program to include diversified plantation systems, because prior to that, they were actually only subsidizing monocultures. So there is a sort of national and sort of cultural interest in sustainable rubber production in Thailand at the moment. And we've been working, as well as with Reckitt, with the Earthworm Foundation to establish in the first instance a new landscape program in southern Thailand that focuses on sustainable rubber production landscapes. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, in terms of within the context of the LEAP process, I think something we've realized over the last few years is that the LEAP process doesn't have to necessarily be completely linear. There are multiple steps that you need to do, but the order in which you do them is perhaps, it depends on how much information you have. So here we're focusing on where's the interface of nature, where's the interface of sensitive locations, identifying, measuring impacts and dependencies, and identifying and measuring, prioritizing risks and opportunities within this smaller landscape to then guide discussion with stakeholders. So this is a desktop-based top-down analysis that we're basically using to arm ourselves with information before we step into the landscape and have a conversation with people on the ground about what can we actually do about this. The next slide, please. So this is broadly reflective of the way our sort of process of nature-based insights works, is we combine company-specific data with these global data sets and models from stuff like the Natural History Museum or the Global model from the Dutch government. And then we combine it with field data, which we use to sort of calibrate and ground truth these models in these landscapes that we work in. Then through some purpose-built modeling techniques and data layers that we produce in-house. We combine that with established and emerging scientific toolkits. And this all feeds into basically a very complicated analytical process that eventually allows for you to fill in TNFD disclosures, and very importantly, set targets for a landscape, do some scenario modeling of what might be good and not good in terms of mitigating your footprint. And then what we're exploring at the moment is how this feeds into the SBTN framework, but of course that's still being developed. Next slide, please. And then if you just click once, I think there'll be little crosses up here. Yeah, thank you. So this is the landscape we're working with within southern Thailand that we've been looking at, and I've been looking at for more than 2 years now. So the little black dots are just examples of traceability information that Reckitt had for this particular landscape, right? So we knew the locations of all the farms that were within this supply chain. So from that, we delineated the landscape on the basis of, what are all the downstream catchment areas of all those farms, so that stuff that might be affected through something like pollution, and what are all the upstream areas of the farms, so where the integrity of nature directly impacts the supply of water to this agricultural product. So you've got already the landscape is being delineated, on the sort of with the flavor of where are my impacts and where are my dependencies. We then combined this traceability data with open source satellite imagery, global land cover data sets to build a land cover map and just build this first qualitative understanding of the landscape. So it's an extremely large river basin called the Tapi River Basin. And at the mouth of it, you have Surat Thani city in the north. Near that city, you have a key biodiversity area, which is a large mangrove forest, which remains unprotected, but has historically been the site of some successful mangrove restoration projects. And then most of the intact forest in the landscape sits within these two large protected areas in the west and the east. So that's Khao Sok in the west and Tyrol Mien in the east. So we have a lot of protected areas, a lot of key biodiversity areas, but what's immediately clear is you have a very developed agricultural landscape within a very large river basin. Next slide, please. So we get to that stage, and then within our sort of approach, we start to apply a whole series of different analyses broadly within the themes of biodiversity, carbon, and risk. Right, so here's an example of some of the data that we use as part of that analysis. So we calculate the biodiversity impact metric in a spatially explicit way. So as a function of 6 different pressures, where are the most impacted areas within this landscape? We calculate connectivity, in this case between forest ecosystems, to identify areas where there might be an opportunity to invest in improving connectivity between existing protected areas. We look at dependencies again, so the distribution of critical natural assets where people are most dependent on ecosystem services from the natural and semi-natural intact ecosystems in the landscape. So this is where you're really going to start to get that, dual benefit of helping people by protecting nature. Because we're trying to balance this with carbon mitigation stuff, we build an in-house carbon stock map. We use Nancy Harris's work from the World Resources Institute to look at historical carbon flux. We look at potential sequestration rates, and then deforestation risk, water stress, floods, and drought. So there's a lot of different layers that go into this. Anyone who's interested is, by all means, get in touch with me afterwards. But it's safe to say we're trying to take a holistic, multi-dimensional view of this landscape. Next slide, please. We then build these kind of prioritization maps, similar to the Tesco work, but on a much more granular basis, structured by the mitigation hierarchy and the sort of 3 classes of nature-based solutions. So where do I protect? Where do I restore? Which farms do I prioritize for sustainable management? That's not shown here because it's commercially sensitive information as to where the farms are located. So from these maps, we then start to prioritize areas for different kinds of solutions within Reckitt sustainability and nature strategy. And this is what we've taken forward into a stakeholder consultation meeting in June last year. Next slide, please. Which included 2 government departments, so the Department of National Parks, the Rubber Authority of Thailand, members of the Sustainable Rubber Association, which is a community-led farmer association that was set up with the help of Reckitt and the Fair Rubber Association. And we take this analysis into them, and we have this whole big conversation about what we're trying to achieve. what their skill sets and what the skill sets and knowledge in the landscape currently is, and how do we design a monitoring and evaluation strategy to complement the interventions that Earthworm is leading within this new developing landscape program. So we're really starting to basically build a landscape program from scratch with all the different skill sets and stakeholders available to us, whether government, NGO, or community-led. Yeah, and it's been a huge journey to get here, and then hopefully over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll start to see some interesting sort of results, especially in terms of linking, ground data with satellite data, because it's something that I just have not seen people do a lot within this space.
Thank you, Gus. Super helpful. Thank you for unpacking that and taking us to that next step of granularity from the previous discussion. Now I have the pleasure for the next 10 minutes to hand it over to Tom to unpack for us some of the challenges and lessons learned, and also next steps, sort of how are you going to apply this knowledge going forward. Over to you, Tom.
Cheers. Thanks, Marianne, and thanks, Gus, taking everyone through that. What I've tried to capture here are some of the key learnings and challenges from our experience during the TNFD, piloting the TNFD LEAP approach. So at the very top of the list is delineating the landscape, and by extension of that, that's defining our interface with nature. We invested a lot of time on this part of the process, as we knew it was absolutely key to get this right. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't want to just use an arbitrary approach, so we worked closely with Gus and the team to plan out how we would do this in a scientifically robust way to ensure that the way we do this is the correct way, or not the correct way, but the best way forward in our minds. And we've been sharing that learning with the Taskforce members. We've been shared this through some of the documentation as well that's been published by the TNFD, through the case studies on our pilot study. The next challenge was defining our dependencies, which we're still in the process of doing some aspects of this, and those dependencies can obviously be direct or indirect, and it's those indirect ones in particular that are the most difficult, the most challenging to actually identify. So the best example I can give on this is within our landscape, there might be a forest or a lake that is miles away from our farms, but the integrity of that is critical to our farms and the yields that actually come out of our plantations. And then this again really highlights the importance of us engaging with our local stakeholders and with our farmers on the ground to understand, well, what are the intricacies of the landscape that aren't always apparent when you're just looking at a top-down map view. And the final challenge that I've highlighted, which probably comes as no surprise to anybody on the call, and again, it's been touched on throughout the two presentations already today, is on data. The actions and the interventions that we're looking at are only as good as the data they're based on, and there is very little data out there, and it's often complex to collect if you want to get the primary data from the ground, and it also may not be location specific as well. We've been using global data sets as well as many regional or local data sets as we can, and as Gus has just alluded to, we are in the process of trying to gather primary data from within the field as well. The data that we need isn't just to enable us to determine what our risks and dependencies are, but also to help us identify, as I mentioned earlier, where the opportunities are in the landscape. And then most importantly, in my mind, is then to enable us to measure and monitor the positive impacts that any interventions that we put in place have over time. And that's only done by having a clear monitoring and evaluation strategy. This has required us to engage and gather data from multiple people within the landscape as well. So again, this comes back to stakeholder engagement. We've been working with researchers, our own suppliers, the farmers themselves, to look at how we can get that information. We've also engaged with NGO partners in the landscape, and Gus mentioned the Earthworm Foundation, who we've been working with for a number of years within our latex supply chain. And that dovetails quite nicely into my first key learning. Again, stakeholder engagement. I think I've probably sound a bit like flogging a dead horse in terms of the number of times I've talked about the importance of stakeholder engagements, but I just want to reiterate, this is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial to anyone who's looking to do this work. that I think you need to make sure you invest the time on this, especially when it comes to implementation and looking to identify what the potential risks are. But beyond the stakeholders that we work with on the ground, the communities working and living within the landscape where we source our latex from, there are also those other actors that are in the same position as us, so in the same position as Reckitt. And what I mean by that is other companies as well as other NGOs that we also need to look at engaging with. And the TNFD framework enables us to build connections with those types of stakeholders, as we need to collaborate with other businesses and the people to build resilience into these supply chains and to tackle the risks, as we're not always the only people sourcing from within a landscape, and we're seeing that in some of our other supply chains that we're exploring at the moment. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that there needs to be better alignment and collaboration in order to tackle the issues that we are all facing, and the TNFD really does provide the framework to enable that, because that framework supports commonality, which I mentioned before, and the more corporates, the more companies that adopt this, it will bring the scale that we need and that greater collaborative action, because we can already see that the TNFD framework is facilitating those conversations with our stakeholders, be it our suppliers, our customers, or as we may have mentioned already, like investors in particular are asking questions around this and asking what we're doing in preparation for the TNFD. So if we could just drop down to my final slides, please. So as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, we set out to develop a process for analysing landscape scale impacts and what the dependencies and risks are within our agricultural supply chains. The overarching aim was really to establish a methodology for consistently applying that approach in multiple supply chains that would also be aligned to the TNFD principles. This process so far, from my perspective, has been successful, and it's enabled us to start establishing a baseline for our impacts on biodiversity within the defined landscape that we've shown. But it's also been used to support stakeholder consultations, as Gus mentioned. So we've run workshops out in the landscape with the local NGOs that we work with, the farmer cooperatives, as well as research institutes and the government departments in that area of Thailand, to kind of understand how can we tackle the risks that we're identifying. So in terms of our next steps at Reckitt, well, we're continuing to engage with those local stakeholders on now identifying the types of interventions that we could be putting in place to protect and restore biodiversity in the landscape. We've also developed a monitoring and evaluation strategy that's I mentioned on the previous slide, is kind of critical for us to know how we can track what the positive impacts are on that our interventions will hopefully be having. And that's also important to help us identify, are the interventions doing what we expect, and do we need to change tact? Do we need to change our approach, or are there other interventions that are more successful than others that we could look to expand or roll out to other areas of the landscape? So we are also currently expanding this approach to other regions and to other key natural raw materials that we identified. And we will be completing the assessment and the risks and opportunities for these once we've gone through the process again of delineating that landscape and defining where our interface with nature is, just as we did with the latex program. But that's not something that we're rushing through. It's been one of those, the one key step for us is making sure that is defined properly at the very beginning. And then finally, I'd say in respects to the TNFD, some of you may have seen last week that Reckitt has signed up as an early adopter of the TNFD. So we have committed to be reporting in line with the TNFD principles. So with that in mind, what we're currently doing at the moment and what our reporting teams are currently going through is the process of reviewing those recommendations, of reviewing the disclosure recommendations, and comparing that against our current reporting governance and procedures to be in position to do that in the coming years. So that's where I'll end my talk. And yeah, thank you very much. Try and answer as many questions as I can.
And thank you so much, Gus and Tom, both. We have about 10 minutes now for questions, and we again have probably more questions than we can answer, but I can see that you've already started to engage, Gus, so that's just wonderful. Yeah, the first one is from Dr. Flavia, and I think you've already answered parts of it, Tom, in your conversation around what's the most challenging of the 4 steps in LEAP. So I'll not post that to you, but it goes on to say that we know that the most mature methods are related to forest and land use in terms of measurement, and that biodiversity is a bit newer. So the question is, what are the most complex biodiversity metrics to measure? I mean, you already highlighted, Gus, complexity and these types of metrics, but if you look at biodiversity metrics, which are the most complex to measure?
Yeah, I think the second part of the question, Gus might be better position to answer, but I did see that question come in and I haven't seen what Gus's response to it, but I did just want to pick up on it and just say that the locate part, and I think I probably hammered this point home quite a lot in my presentation, that I wouldn't say that it was challenging in the sense of difficult to do, but I think it's very difficult to make sure you do it right. And I think that, as I mentioned, we spent a lot of time going through what the options of how we could delineate our landscapes, how we could define that interface with nature, because from our point of view, that if you get that wrong, or you don't do that as best as you can, you're not so much setting yourself up for failure, but the impact that you could be having on the rest of the work you do may be missing areas, may not be as impactful as you would hope it to be. You might then find that there are other areas of the dependencies that you've missed.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Gus, on what are the most complex biodiversity metrics to capture and measure?
Yeah, I wonder if there are any biodiversity academics in the room who are probably sitting there desperately wanting to answer. I think probably for me, some of the most complex stuff to measure, either from a desktop-based perspective or even on the ground, are ecosystem services. So a lot of the metrics that exist for company footprinting are species-based, right, including the biodiversity impact metric. And there's an obvious reason for this in terms of existing data within the scientific literature, but ecosystem services is really where we start to get towards economic arguments around the value of biodiversity, which might sound a bit sort of harsh to commoditize biodiversity like that, but it's an important part of the conversation. So ecosystem services are very difficult to model accurately and to measure on the ground. And then I mean, in terms of forests being the focus ecosystems, I'm saying this obviously with a bit of bias from my background. There are no tools at all for businesses to look at impacts upon the marine environment. Almost all these businesses will be having it either at the land-sea interaction, inflection point, or by polluting rivers that then flow into the sea, or by directly sourcing stuff, whether it's seaweed, seagrass, kelp, from the marine environment. Krill, fish, all these products are going into consumer goods companies' portfolios, but there is there's almost nothing available for businesses to actually measure their impact. So that's completely in the shadows. And then I think ecosystem services from a technical perspective, even with forests, is quite difficult to directly measure.
Thank you so much, Gus. And the next question I'll direct to you, Tom, which is around, is it your expectation as a TNFD early adopter that you will undertake this type of analysis for all high impact commodities in your supply chain?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we've gone through this process of identifying the kind of priority natural raw materials, and that's been based on looking at not only what's important to the business, but also what's important in terms of which of those natural materials could be associated with a high impact and the influence that we can then have within those supply chains. So at the moment, we've publicly committed to doing this process for 5 natural raw materials. So latex has been our pilot to go through that process, and we are already in the process of doing that for another 2. And by the end of in the next couple of years, we'll have rolled that out to the kind of subsequent 3. So I don't want to name all of them, but we are also looking to include some of our fragrances as well within that 5 list of natural raw materials. And we are finding, as we go from supply chain to supply chain, there are some common challenges, let's say, but we're also seeing that there are some unique challenges within supply chains as well, that across fragrances, for example, that we have to unpick and solve as we go along. So we might find ourselves having to do a couple of almost piloting sessions again to ensure that we do get everything right.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We'll be looking forward to following that journey with you. Now, there's a bit of a different question, which is around the capabilities that you need in-house. It says for companies looking to undertake these types of analyses in-house, what would you recommend in terms of upskilling or training resources? You want to talk to that, Tom?
Well, that's a very good question. We've obviously, when we started out on this journey, we've obviously been able to identify that we don't have all of the skills and capabilities internally to do a lot of this work, which is why we've gone to Gus and Cecile, who's one of the other people we've worked at MBI, to kind of lean on their expertise to make sure that this is done correctly. I'm certain you can obviously go through the process of upskilling and training people to do this work, but we've taken the decision that leaning on the expertise and engaging with people such as Gus, because of the years of experience and years of knowledge that they have, is the best approach for us at the moment.
Excellent. And there's the same question again, Gus, that we had to the last session around the time required. It says that this looks like more comprehensive and more work. So what were the inputs needed to conduct this?
There's a lot of inputs, and I will go all the way to 11 if I list them all now. Yeah, look, it's developed over time, first of all. So we didn't set out initially. We set out initially with the task of, what's my impact on biodiversity? Just that simple question with a somewhat complex answer. But as time evolved and new science was emerged and new guidance emerged, we eventually started adding, iteratively new dimensions. We haven't looked at connectivity before. Okay, what are we going to do about the dependencies thing in the ecosystem services? It's complex to model. Do we have time? Is there a proxy we can use? So we currently have about 20 or so different data sets that go into the entire holistic, reporting process that we do when we analyze landscapes. But that evolved over the space of, 2 years since we've technically been working on this in terms of, coding and geospatial analysis. So, and bear in mind that in terms of that time taken, that was also the time it took. We were building the processes in the first instances. So for a company doing it, it's a matter of economy of scale, right? Once you're doing it once and you invest in all the capacity needed to do it once, then suddenly it can be a lot more efficient. So this year we're doing that same analysis for 2 different commodities in 2 different countries of the world. In 1 year, what took us 2 years to do initially is now we're doing double the amount of output in half the amount of time. So I think you need to think of it in those terms rather than how long is this going to take me. And I think it speaks to Tom's upskilling point that it really does help to, biodiversity is very complex, and carbon is complex in terms of the carbon cycle and everything, but biodiversity is incredibly complex. And like I was talking about with the data, you almost need someone with a bit of that background in order to navigate all of these. If you want to do it in-house, to navigate all these different data sets and know how to implement them in the first place. Otherwise, you're just stuck with the zigzag mouth saying, I don't know actually what to do first.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those reflections. And Tom, do you want to comment?
I just wanted to add to it very quickly, just to kind of, promote this TNFD again. That was one of the reasons, again, why we joined the Taskforce and why we've been active members, is that we appreciate and have realised in the beginning that this needs to be done collaboratively. It's why we've worked with Gus and the team from MBI. It's why we engaged with the TNFDs, that we don't just want to be insular in the work that we're doing. We want to be sharing that with the wider community to ensure that, as I said in the talk, everyone comes along on the same journey, that everyone can benefit from our learnings. That's why we're doing this webinar in the first place, is that we want to be doing that. We don't just want to be keeping our learnings in-house that look great in our annual report, but it's about that bigger picture, about being part of that bigger community and the impact that we can have by supporting others in their progress as well.
Thank you so much. And at the TNFD level, just as you said, Tom, we will continue to build this type of community of practice, because there's no need to sit and reinvent the wheel in every organization. We might as well reap the benefits, as Gus said, about the learning curves that some of you have already been on. So we just have time for a last question, which is, have you gone as far as quantifying nature-related risks stemming from your impacts and dependencies, so into actual financial risks to the business? Tom, you want to go ahead?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? My line just broke up a bit on me there. Apologies.
Okay, it is, have you gone as far as quantifying or translating your impacts and dependencies into quantified financial risks for the business?
Okay, yeah, it's something that we're looking at the moment. It's part of what we're obviously going through the process within the TNFD and when we come to looking at doing our disclosures. So it's something we're currently looking at. I know there might have been a bit of work done previously, but it's a focus at the moment within our team and the wider team looking at this.
Thank you so much. And Gus, do you want to share some reflections on that step, going from
No,
impacts
I
dependencies
think
to risks?
if we get to that point of saying, hey, like if you do nothing, it's going to cost you this much in the next 10 years. Well, if you do something, it'll cost you X amount now, but you'll save money in the long term. I think that would be the ultimate conversation start. You know, I mean, that would, at that point, everyone can talk on common terms, right? We don't have to worry about terms like nature's contribution to people. It's very difficult, though. I mean, what's the cost of doing nothing? We can talk about it in a global context from work from like the World Economic Forum, but it's the cost of doing nothing in southern Thailand in that landscape.
Yeah.
You need a lot of information. I don't think there's a lot of clear processes in terms of the economic valuation of natural capital. There's no one process that stands up above the others. If people do purpose-built studies in West Africa to value rubber plantations, is that the same value in southern Thailand? You know, it's incredibly complicated task. I think it's really important that we start moving towards that kind of conversation, that kind of granular, what is your economic risk from the degradation or loss of nature? How much are you going to de-risk yourself by doing it? But currently, it's largely a qualitative conversation.
Yeah.
We know from past experience that
Yeah.
this process helps reduce drought risk.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I completely agree with that call to action. And thank you for ending us on that note that now we need the quantitative skills and we need to translate these impacts and dependencies into actual financial risks, but that needs more work. I want to now, we come to the close of the second chapter. Thank the panel. Thank you to Dr. Gus. Thank you to Thomas. Thank you to Tom for sharing your practices. They were extremely informative, and thank you for being such an engaging audience. We will make sure to share slides and also the recording with you. And you can dive into each of these case studies in much more detail. You will find them on the Global Canopy website. You see them here displayed. And next slide. And my last call to action to all of you is to go in on the TNFD website, where we have the sector-specific guidance, which is the LEAP guidance to apply LEAP in specific sectors. Here you see the food and agriculture sector guidance, and at the end of it, you will have the sector-specific metrics, which are a specification of the TNFD global core metrics that are applicable across sectors, and then we have sector adjusted them. The deadline for feedback is on March 29th. It's a very easy, accessible platform. It won't take you long to go in, so we would really appreciate all of your feedback. I want to thank all of you. I don't know if you want to have a last word. We have 3 minutes left. Gus, do you want to have a last word to say what's the next thing you need to do if you go back in your organization on Monday and want to start to do this? Just one sentence.
Yeah, I won't have the last word, but I'll say something. Yeah, I mean, just get started. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, it's one foot in front of the other. It's a bit of a mountain to climb, but the more you overthink it, the less progress you're going to make. At a certain point, you just need to get started in understanding and measuring in the first place.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Just get started. And then Thomas, over to you.
Oh, he's stolen my thunder. I would say start looking at how you do your reporting and start speaking to your suppliers about what information is available and then where you want to get to.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A last word for you, Tom?
I would say don't be afraid to start small. You haven't got to boil the ocean. As Gus said, start doing something is better than doing nothing.
Thank you so much. Just get started. Get started by talking to your suppliers. What data do you already have? And start small. You can scale quickly. Thank you so much. Thank you to the whole panel. Thank you to all the great questions. And we hope that you will answer the survey and that you will engage in the feedback session. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you very much.